Now we're moving on from our discussion of social networking in academia and the formation of academic habitus to accumulate social capital to talk about the rise of the corporate university. So in the public consciousness, the university is this disembodied abstract entity, this tower of knowledge and scholars who are floating in the sky, divorced from the lives of normal people trying to make a living under capitalism. So the university and education in general is traditionally seen as separate from capitalism and the logic of capital. It's seen as a community of scholars that's insulated from and protected from the harsh realities and current events of the world. So the university in this traditional view is seen as a pure and free place that's untainted from commercial interests. And faculty and university members allegedly use that space to look backwards in history and romanticize values of the past through studying things like anthropology or archaeology or Latin, the dead language, or medieval art history, or ancient Greek philosophy, or classical economics, as if these scholars in these institutions live and do their work in the past and are unaware of and unrelated to the present day problems of the world. This cartoon image on the slide portrays that stereotypical image of the stuffy, refined, sophisticated, eloquent academic who's holed up in their ivory tower, something that's untouchable, and again, in the sky and out of reach from the troubles of the world. And they very much represent the typical figure of the professor wearing the tweedy jacket with elbow patches and a cardigan underneath, with a book under their arm and proclaiming, "I do concur, indubitably," and just waxing philosophical and romanticizing about the past, again, while being insulated within their ivory tower, distanced from current events and structures and power dynamics in the world of present day, as if they're detached from the same profit motives and commercial interests that other discourses and entities and institutions operating in contemporary capitalist society are driven by. So educational institutions have historically been seen as separate from the realities of capitalist society. That's the traditional view of the university that persisted up until about the 70s. Just a bunch of Marxists and deconstructionists and philosophers just contemplating on abstract theories without really being affected by the material consequences of the economy and society and politics of present day. So this is a very traditional conception of what the university is or was, and what its function is ideally intended and portrayed to be in relation to society, or perhaps its respectful distance and separation from the rest of society. Before the 70s, universities were a lot more untainted from commercial interests and resembled this traditionally held conception of the classical university. But since then, universities and the real world of commercial interests and profit incentive and structure and social structures and power inequalities have become much more integrated than this idealized image. So universities transitioned into commercial entities around the 1970s during that whole shift to post-Fordism and neoliberalism, and the move away from a focus on heavy industries such as raw resources like oil to more knowledge-based industries, treating our brain labor and the products of our thinking as the new resources to be extracted. So until the 70s, capitalism kind of kept its hands off of academia, but capitalism eventually ran out of things to exploit and expand its logic into. They had kind of run out of raw resources to extract, like gold and oil. So now they had to increasingly extract brain resources and the cognitive resources of our intellect and research and creativity. So now we live in a time where the boundaries between the real world and academia have dissolved. So now the problems of the world have become the problems of academia. Professors are no longer comfortably holed up in their ivory towers or refined and tweedy. They increasingly take the form of underpaid graduate students hired as part-time lecturers. Sound familiar? or post-grad sessional instructors hopping from one university to the next. The Johnson reading calls this the professoriate. So you may be familiar with the term proletariat, meant to describe the working class. This reading is trying to get across the idea that professors and the community of scholars is increasingly becoming a mass of the proletariat. Their work as professors and scholars is increasingly becoming monitored and reviewed by administrators who put a lot of the accountability and liability on part-time faculty, tenuous employment, precarious employment. And as opposed to the traditional view of the university as covered on the previous slide, universities nowadays don't dismiss or disregard the profit seekers at their gates. Rather, they embrace them with open arms. They cut deals to integrate education with commercial interests, with the incentive of reaping profits from the untapped audience of students and would-be learners. So they start to view programs of students as markets of consumers, just like consumers of any other service or product that's in supply and demand. So the threat to academia is no longer an occasional war or political crisis to disrupt the studious academic types in their insulated ivory tower. It's a much more pressing and urgent and ever-encroaching pressure of corporatization, the corporate takeover of decision-making at all levels of educational institutions, how courses are structured, how learning is conducted, how many students are put into each classroom, who is hired to teach them, how much they get paid, etc. So in this cartoon, we have the ivory tower, just as in the previous slide, but now it's no longer separate and standing alone. Now it's standing beside the commerce building. And someone's remarking, I'm afraid the building next door might be undermining your foundations. So literally, but also figuratively, the coming closeness of commerce with and into academia is undermining the foundational values of academia that made it what it formerly was on the previous slide. So that institutionalized education is increasingly indistinguishable from any other profit-seeking corporate commercial institution. So corporate entities used to try to wield and exert their influence on academic institutions such as universities in ways like sponsoring buildings on campus and having them named after the corporation to kind of increase their reputation or legitimacy. Also, by being associated with the university program, they could have had a small degree of influence in its structure and direction. Like they could threaten to remove their sponsorship and their funding if there's a professor who's radical that they don't like in the department. So corporate and commercial influences wielded a bit of indirect influence, but now they want more direct management of the process of education and to structure it on their terms. They don't care about a campus building having their name on it so much as having these institutions serve these corporations as a training grounds to produce a constantly replenishable workforce that they can grab from and plug into their corporate machinery. And as a result, academia is increasingly restructured to reflect corporate and commercial values, such as increasing efficiency, cutting costs, and maximizing profits. So now universities are operating more like a for-profit business. They have a bottom line and they're trying to maximize their profits and minimize their costs. And thus they're trying to cut down on their expenditures. So these educational institutions such as universities start making business decisions when it comes to matters such as cutting or funding programs. And from this newly integrated capitalist frame of considerations, they're not looking at the inherent value of the education within those programs, but are instead making decisions based on which ones are most profitable for the university and which ones are losing them money. So those universities are less likely to cut sports programs because those can draw in more money than a fine arts program, for example, or history program. And just like any other corporation, universities are constantly reviewing the productivity of their different programs to find places to trim the fat and eliminate areas of education that they don't see as profitable. So, for example, earlier this year, Laurentian University in Ontario cut 69 of their academic programs and more than 100 faculty jobs. And of the 69 programs cut, 58 of them were academic programs. And among these discontinued programs include undergrad degrees in anthropology, environmental science, geography, mathematics, modern language, music, philosophy, political science, Italian and Spanish, and more. And I guess those academic programs were considered expendable because they're not as financially lucrative as the STEM disciplines whose research produces more patentable and profit generating products. So Laurentian basically cut any programs that they didn't see as being cash cows. There were programs that the institutions couldn't see bringing in a lot of profit, so they just cut them on a massive scale and just eliminated a large part of their educational offerings. This integration of the post-secondary education system with business interests has resulted in a switch from universities focusing on teaching and learning to purely focusing on research. So most of the highly prestigious universities in the world are considered research universities. Because if a university and its laboratories and research teams produce significant findings, those findings can be patented and monetized and then sold. So full-time teaching careers from well-established professors are subjected to that same cost-benefit analysis of the university and deemed too costly and not profitable enough. So they're largely replaced by part-time laborers and contract workers who can do approximately the same job at a lower cost. And classroom sizes are dramatically increased at the expense of quality education. And like I said, the university's focus shifts from educational aspects to research aspects of patenting findings and developing monetizable course software that can then be sold to other institutions or universities. So now professors are just as much part of the gig economy as any other worker. Like as a sessional instructor myself, I find myself jumping from contract to contract. I have a contract this semester, I'm not guaranteed a contract next semester. Just as many workers find themselves in many other jobs and career fields. It's a precarious employment situation, and as a result, I don't see myself as a talented academic who possesses valuable skills and is offering a valuable service. I just see myself as a worker just like any other, and this is where the proletarianization comes from, where even the professors are turned into the professoriate. And this proletarianization is affecting more and more people in brain power jobs, people who use their brain and their mind and their creativity to work. Due to this corporate takeover and concomitant developments in technological capability, a lot of those jobs are fading away and the middle class itself is dissolving. So now you only have the ultra elites, those in power, and the ruling class, and then an increasingly large proletariat class that more and more of us are finding ourselves in. So the middle class, the buffer between the ruling classes and the ruled, is essentially gone now, and it's just the ruling classes and a larger proportion of the ruled. Like there used to be a distinction between blue collar labor and white collar labor, but now we're all blue collar. Like my job is no more safe or distinguished or privileged than a mechanic or a plumber. As a matter of fact, sometimes I think my dad and brother were onto something, and that I maybe should have followed in the family business in their footsteps, because at least I'd have more job security now. So probably close to 75% of teaching in accredited universities are now done by a contingent workforce comprising individuals such as myself, part-time, contracted, seasonal workers who save the university money and helps their bottom line of their financial ledger. And to give an example of a corporation naming a university campus building after itself, universities still do this and accept sponsors for their campus buildings because they can get revenue by shilling out their buildings to be named by corporate sponsors. And an example of this is Gold Corp Center for the Arts in SFU's downtown campus, which houses the Fine Arts program, and it's named after Gold Corp, which is a company that specializes in raw resource extraction. It's basically a gold mining company. and they're sponsoring the Center for Fine Arts. But as long as the money is good, that's all that matters to SFU. They don't really care that being named after a mining company kind of goes against and undermines, no pun intended, the moral foundation and academic values of the whole fine arts program. So academia was supposed to be the only institution that's pure and free of commercial interests and profit motives and business incentives. But those latter forces have since merged into essentially every aspect of this formerly separate institution of academia. Another example of how SFU and universities in general operate more as businesses is the SFU administration's trying to fire the food service workers and cafeteria staff recently because the university's contract was up with the working group that hired and employed all those service workers, and SFU wanted to make another contract with a different third party who was offering a cheaper deal. There was little to no consideration of the human element in this administrative decision to let go of workers who had been there for decades, and they weren't being let go for their performance or anything that they could personally control. The decision was purely about the bottom line of what saves the university more money. Anything that can save them money and increase their profits is what the university is going to do. Another example of universities acting like corporations is their fixation on their brand. They're very preoccupied with strategically designing and promoting and updating their brand to appeal to their potential customers or consumers, aka prospective students. So my alma mater, Western, where while I was there in undergrad, they changed their name and did a brand update. They went from University of Western Ontario, which makes sense because it is a university located in Western Ontario, to Western University or Western U or just Western, because I guess that appeals to a more globalized audience of international students by marketing itself as the Western University, like the university in the West for international students to come study and pay their international student fees and increase Western's reputation worldwide, instead of just appealing to local and regional students who don't see anything Western about a university that's in Ontario, which is Eastern Canada. Like, imagine growing up in BC, the actual west of Canada, and then one of your buddies from high school is like, oh, I'm going to Western. Like, oh yeah? Which direction are you traveling to get to Western? This can be very disillusioning and sobering when you're already a student of the school. As they're going through a brand change, you start to realize what their priorities are. Because as a student there, I can guarantee that money may have been better spent, at least for my purposes of learning, on faculty and staff and academic programs. But Western couldn't care any less about the students it already had, because they already have their money. They care about appealing to the market of potential consumers, and they want to make that market as global as possible. Another example of how universities act like businesses is that many schools require instructors to offer blockbuster courses, like very exciting courses that draw a lot of press attention and get a lot of students to enroll, because it's largely about maximizing those profits and enrolling as many students and getting the most butts in the seats. So that leaves teachers to cater their courses to topics that they may not be interested in or specialize in, but just purely to make it appealing to a wide audience. So McGill University, for example, its religious studies department used to offer a course on the city's hockey team, the Montreal Canadiens, as a religion. And this is largely done because it's a popular, well-known sports team in the city and in the country. So a course offering like this attracts headlines and generates word of mouth and creates a buzz and drums up interest, almost like some sort of guerrilla marketing campaign, which is strange to think of a university engaging in a marketing campaign, but Western and McGill are two examples of strategic marketing at the university level. I've also heard of other religious studies departments in other universities offering courses on the Jedi religion from Star Wars, or foreign language departments teaching the Dothraki language from Game of Thrones, or the Klingon language from Star Trek, or literature departments offering entire courses on zombies or vampires. Like on the slide, I included a news headline about a course offered at the University of Baltimore that's all about zombies. And there is a lot of analytical value in like textual figures in horror. There's even a whole body of literary studies called monster studies, monster theory. And it seems like they're going to get into that in that course, but they're also just trying to market it with a broad appeal. Stuff like, oh, we're going to get you ready for the zombie apocalypse, and you're not going to write any essays, we're going to write horror movies. And yeah, even though it's called English 30333, let's call it Zombies 101. Like, this is all done largely for the potential media coverage, and in this case it was successful because newspapers did cover it, and the pop culture credibility, the coolness factor that gives these institutions some artificial clout amongst their customers, aka students who pay tuitions to fund and finance these institutions. The major change to befall universities over the past few decades has been the identification of the campus as a significant site of capital accumulation and the systematic conversion of intellectual activity, aka brain work and cognitive and creative labor, into intellectual capital and consequently intellectual property. So it's a matter of turning the dynamic process of creative thinking into a fixed product, a commodity, a piece of property that is owned, not by the person who created it, but by the university who employs that individual and owns the product of their cognitive labor. This involves, firstly, the commoditization of the research function of the university, which turns laboratory research, such as chemical, biological, medical, or engineering knowledge, into commercially viable proprietary products that can be owned and bought and sold in the market. So for example, let's take those Oxford researchers who created a vaccine for COVID. Do you think they own the patent to that vaccine, those individual researchers, those individual workers who had the brilliance to come up with the formula for the vaccine? Do you think they own any part of that vaccine? No, that's all Oxford. And Oxford partnered with AstraZeneca to manufacture and distribute it on a mass scale. And Oxford's making a lot of money as a result of that research that the institution had the foresight to claim proprietary ownership over. So it's a matter of turning intangible and immaterial thoughts and brainwaves into tangible material commodities that can be sold for great profit by the university who owns the patents to that research. So capitalism and the logic of capital expands everywhere, to every area of everyday life. Any sort of unexplored territory, it will eventually expand into. And the logic of capital has expanded into the territory of knowledge production. And where is knowledge produced? In universities. So necessarily the two have become imbricated, capitalism and universities. And this leads to a proliferation of all sorts of industrial partnerships with universities and proprietary arrangements so that corporations are the first in line to benefit from the conveyor belt of patented ideas and technologies that are continually being produced and packaged and sold by the research function of universities. Also, universities have a unique structure that makes them very conducive to extracting brain power and transforming it into saleable commodities, as universities are publicly funded by the government as well as, of course, students' tuition and alumni donations. So the costs of creating this knowledge are put onto the public. So universities, they don't even have to put their hands into their own pockets to pay for research equipment or pay the salaries of their researchers. That's done for them by all these public subsidies and tuition fees, so that the costs of this research are socialized while the benefits of this research are privatized, so that when a piece of knowledge, a piece of patented knowledge becomes profitable, it's not like all the students who paid tuition and all the alumni who donated get a piece of that profit. The universities are all about spreading the love when it comes to sharing costs, but when it comes to sharing profit, suddenly they're not so loving. That belongs exclusively to them. So it's weird to think about, but universities are patent holding companies. And that's often their biggest money maker. And a huge part of their focus is holding patents and being able to license out these patents to corporations so as to maximize their profits. Like I said, the most prestigious universities in the world, including in Canada, Western and U of T and Queen's and McGill, they all consider themselves research universities because that's where the real money is to be made. And the result of this commoditization of the research function of the university has been a wholesale reallocation of university resources towards increasing the efficiency of its research function at the expense of its education function. So when it comes to determining whether or not a program in a university gets funding, if that program has a good chance of producing patentable and commoditizable knowledge, then they're more likely to get funding over something like a fine arts program. So programs that are mostly about teaching and not research deteriorate as a result of lack of funding, and class sizes will swell, teaching staff and instructional resources will be cut, salaries frozen, curricular offerings cut to the bone, despite at the same time tuition fees soaring. I would love to see a breakdown of where your tuition fees go to, because I bet a small portion of it actually goes to reflect the quality of your education, and most of it is funneled into the research areas of that university that your education may not even be part of or involved with. So thousands of fine arts students stuffed into a small classroom and program, you'd think would yield a very well-funded and resourceful program with all those thousands of students' tuition fees. But a lot of those eggs are taken out of that basket and put into the research basket of the university, so that students end up paying more for their education while getting less. Many corporations want universities to provide students with just-in-time knowledge. So that is the skills necessary for the job at hand, rather than basic transferable skills. So corporations just want universities to serve as a training site for specific jobs that they're trying to fill. And the Johnson reading gives an example of the DigiPen Institute of Technology in Washington State. And you know what else in Washington State? Nintendo headquarters, or at least North American headquarters. But you know who owns and operates the DigiPen Institute of Technology? Nintendo Corp. And in this higher education institution, students don't take any humanities or social sciences courses whatsoever, because those things are superfluous to the labor needs of Nintendo Corp in terms of the skills and values that it requires from its workforce. The only things they teach you at the DigiPen Institute of Technology is how to perform specific tasks and jobs that are required by Nintendo. They don't care about fostering individual or collective self-knowledge or helping you become a more well-rounded person. They just want you to know how to do the job at hand that they want to hire you for. It's basically a glorified training program where they just provide you with the knowledge you need to get the job done and nothing more. So this is arguably more practical training than education, because education is supposed to involve some individual and collective self-revelation, self-growth. But this kind of instruction is more about strictly how to perform a task for someone other than you. That's what training is. It's just habituating your mind and body to performing a certain task at the behest of someone else who you're working for and performing that task for. So here we come to the distinction between education and training. Education is an interpersonal process. It's a relationship between people, student-teacher, or between students and other students, that aims at individual and collective self-knowledge. Think about your most memorable educational experiences in your life. You probably won't remember the specific information you learned or the topic you were learning, but it's more likely that you'll remember the people involved in making those memories, such as your favorite teacher from elementary school or high school, or someone who changed your mind, or people who made a significant difference in how you relate to the world or how you relate to yourself. So that relationship between people is what's essential and central to education. Education is a process of becoming for all parties involved, even the teacher. Training, however, is the honing of a person's mind so that the mind and the body can be used for the purposes of someone other than that person. So in this context, knowledge is strictly defined not as knowledge of the self, but as a strict set of skills or a body of information that can be put to use and become instrumentalized or operationalized. And again, it's put to use for someone else's benefit other than the person being trained. So your boss or your employer or the owner of the company you're being trained to work for. And in this way, training is actually counterintuitive to education because you're not learning any more about yourself. In fact, you're severing that relationship between knowledge and the self. So now it's knowledge for the sake of someone else. Thus, training can be alienating because it circumvents self-knowledge and that interpersonal relationship aspect that's essential for genuine learning, and replaces it with just rote memorization or task efficiency. And remote learning, remote instruction, which is what we're doing right now, is arguably more suited for training rather than education, because its focus is more on the learning materials and the final results rather than the relationships formed through the process of learning. So remote instruction is all about putting the syllabus and the readings and the lecture videos online to sever that connection between the teacher and the student, so that the teachers upload these materials that constitute an educational experience to a website and the student just downloads them or streams them at their convenience. And it can be very alienating for both parties. For me, it's alienating as the instructor because I don't feel like I own or am connected to the product of my labor. Like, I put a lot of time and effort and expertise into these lecture videos and into the course in general, but then that product of my labor is alienated and severed and separated from me when I just upload it online, and then it's gone into the ether. And I'm just hoping it reaches its intended destination with the intended effects of its recipient learning something. But I can't see the learning take place or confirm that it is actually happening. I feel like a worker at an automotive factory who's assembling a car, and then once I've assembled the car, I don't get to drive the car or enjoy seeing someone else drive the car. The final product just rolls off the assembly line, never to be seen again by me. And the process of creating that car in the first place is never seen by the person who eventually gets to drive it. That's how I feel. My lecture and my course materials are like that car. I assemble it and off it goes. And I don't own it even though I built it. So just like last week when we were discussing the ideological role unintentionally played by doctors who grow up idolizing and wanting to be part of the medical field, ideology is also at work here in the sense that students and young people in general are made to want and desire and actively seek out training over education. They've been told and grown to learn within the neoliberal capitalist culture and consumer culture that they've grown up in that education should just be training, just a stepping stone to that job of their dreams. And I don't blame students, it's ideology that's at work within them. I was the exact same way when I was in high school and early undergrad. The entire reason why I chose political science as the program for my undergrad degree didn't have anything to do with me being interested in political science. It was more because at the time I wanted to be a lawyer, and political science was a common stepping stone to get to law school. And then in third year, I coincidentally took my first political theory course, which would prove to be very fateful. The professor was the most brilliant orator I've ever had the privilege of listening to on a weekly basis, and my TA was so supportive and inspirational. And that was the course where I was first introduced to Foucault and a lot of other theories that really changed my mind and perspective on what I wanted to pursue in life and put my talents towards. And the rest is history. And instead of going to law school after undergrad, I did a master's degree in political theory in that department. And that professor was my supervisor, and I TA'd that course. And that former TA became a close colleague of mine, and coincidentally enough, they are now a professor in political science at SFU. So shout out Mike Lawrence. Please take one of his classes if you can. You will not regret it. And tell him Andrew said hi. He'll get a kick out of that. All that was to say that I don't blame anyone who wants to pursue business school or law school, because I see and have personally felt the draw and appeal of these popular educational paths that are instilled with us at a very young age before we even get to university and start making those important educational and career and life choices. We're already made to want and desire to be a doctor or a lawyer or a business person because that's what discourse has glorified and made to seem like the default choices for any bright person to pursue in their education. And as a result, we get legions of lawyers and one political theory major. So under this ideology, the student is seen as a customer, and the customer is always right. Whatever the customer wants, the customer gets. And students as customers want training over education. But sometimes we don't know what we don't know, and we don't know what we think we want to know. And what we think we want to know turns out to not be what we needed to know. You know? If you know, you know. So let's say you get your wish and get into a program of your dreams that only teaches you the exact things you want to know to get your dream job. And then better yet, let's say you do get your dream job after that. What happens if, say, you're laid off from the job you were specifically trained for? Or what happens if that career or industry entirely is no longer viable due to unforeseen circumstances? Like, let's say you get a diploma in tourism and hospitality management, which is offered by various universities, including Royal Roads University on Vancouver Island. And let's say you learned a very specific skill set related to tourism and hospitality so that you're all set for your career in tourism. And then, oops, suddenly a pandemic hits that shutters the global tourism industry. And because you decided to be so narrow and specialized in your training, you have no generally transferable knowledge or skills to any other areas. And you may be out of luck. And you may have wished you did study a bit of philosophy or just pursued some more generalizable education. So treating the student as a customer necessarily turns education into a product, into something that can be consumed, something that students pay for with their tuition, and then they get the product or the service they paid for. And that product is the degree itself, not the process of learning to attain that degree. That the student couldn't care less about. They just want the piece of paper that says that they're qualified for the job they want. So it's turning education into a marketplace that's driven by supply and demand and questions of profitability. And it just reduces everything to a question of utility, so that students start asking, what usefulness is this topic to me? Or why should I have an interest in talking about dreams or school or the body? How is that going to help me get a job at Microsoft or Nintendo? Like I said, students don't know what they don't know, but oftentimes they think they know everything, and as if they know exactly what is and isn't valuable to learn. And this can be dangerous because they are making those utilitarian decisions of what forms of education to pursue based on their ideologically tinted lens that's already telling them what is and isn't valuable to learn, causing them to just dismiss valid topics entirely and just omit a lot of potential learning that could be helpful in unexpected ways. When I first taught this course, there was a week on play and games, and one student, a very good, bright student who got an A in the class, had the gall to tell their TA, games do not interest me. Why would I watch that lecture? Like, excuse me? Imagine having that entitled mindset. This topic does not interest me, therefore I'm not going to attempt it. Do you know how many classes I would have skipped in undergrad if I had that mindset? I was in poli-sci, for goodness sake. The entire Canadian government course would have just been a write-off. Like, God forbid you learn something new. I forgot that's not what a lot of students are here for. They just want to walk in, not learn anything, and walk out with a degree that confirms their assumption that they already know everything.